that its four sides are not perfectly straight, but subtly curved, with a precision so refined that modern surveyors still argue whether the builders were mapping straight lines or sculpting geometry. That its slope locks to the golden ratio, and its height echoes the curvature of the planet itself, as if someone folded the Earth's mathematics into stone. And yet the official story tells us it was all done with copper chisels, wooden sledges, and manpower. A Bronze Age megastructure built by grit, rope, and desert heat. But when you look at the numbers, really look, you start to feel something unsettling. Either the ancients were far more advanced than we think, or we are missing an entire chapter of human history. What if I told you that the Great Pyramid lines up to true north with an error smaller than a human hair? Its four sides curve with such precision that modern surveyors still debate whether they were ever meant to be straight at all. Its slope encodes the golden ratio and its height mirrors the planet's curvature. All of these exact proportions seem to fold the Earth itself into geometry, and yet the story says it was all done with copper chisels and hauling ropes, a Bronze Age miracle born of sweat, sand, and willpower. So how does a 4,500-year-old monument still outsmart our laser measurements, our compasses, even our sense of proportion? Perhaps because it wasn't built just once. Perhaps it was inherited, reworked, and repurposed, a monument far older than the civilization that claimed it. Beneath that same sand, the mystery only deepens. Tunnels run like veins under the plateau. Passages that dive into blackness, chambers cut from bedrock with angles too exact to be random. Explorers trace them until water, collapse, or sealed doors stop the way. Some call it the labyrinth, others whisper of a hall of records. An archive said to guard the memory of a world erased by flood and fire. Ancient writers hinted at it long before scanners confirmed the echoes below. Herodotus described vaults connected by water and stone. The inventory. Stela spoke of Khufu finding sacred structures already old in his day. Even modern muon scans still register perfect geometric voids where no passage should exist, as if the ground itself remembers rooms we can no longer reach. Now, before we follow those tunnels any deeper, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy, and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button or a friendly comment sure does go a long way to keep these journeys coming. Now let's go back to the sand and see what mysteries might still be waiting there. The desert wind carries the low sound of tourists at Giza. The hum of traffic from Cairo fades as their voices drift across the plateau, echoing against stone that has stood longer than most of human memory. Dust swirls near the base of the Great Pyramid, catching in the gold light of late afternoon, the same desert tone that has brushed these blocks for millennia. At first glance, everything feels resolved. A miracle of construction explained by human will and the patient logic of history. The signs tell a simple story. Khufu, a king of Egypt's 4th dynasty, commanded his people to raise the grandest tomb the world had ever seen. Over 2 million limestone blocks, quarried from nearby cliffs and ferried on sledges, stacked into a mountain of geometry. Each stone placed by hands that obeyed both the pharaoh's order and an ancient rhythm of labor. In the accepted view, the scene is almost cinematic. Copper chisels glint in the morning light, ropes pull tight, and ramps of packed river mud rise like the serpent paths of a colossal workshop. Surveyors drag ropes taut to fix straight lines on the desert floor, their marks glowing faintly in the sun. Workers shout timing songs so blocks lift in unison, the air thick with quarry dust and sweat. And above all this motion stands the king's overseers, ensuring that Khufu's name, etched on every plan and tally, will endure through ages. The narrative holds so firmly because it fits the frame that archaeology prefers. A clear origin, a known date, a purposeful monument in a recognizable civilization. Generations of scholars built that frame with care. In the 19th century, Excavations at the Giza Plateau merged with a rising fascination for scientific history, a desire to chart civilization's rise through evidence, not legend. The pyramid became proof of progress. Humans, through coordination and simple tools, lifted stone until it touched the sky. When painted hieroglyphs were reported in the small chambers above the king's chamber bearing Khufu's mark, the final link clicked into place. Egyptology adopted this as confirmation so complete that it rarely required revisiting. Museums reproduced it in dioramas. Textbooks illustrated it with diagrams of ramps wrapping upward like corkscrews. Each generation copied the same flourish of certainty from the one before, yet inside that confidence lives a quiet contradiction. The stones forgive no imprecision. Each side of the Great Pyramid measures roughly 230 meters, their corners meeting within centimeters of perfection. The structure's orientation faces true north with astonishing accuracy, deviating by only a fraction of a degree. For copper blades and rope lines, this level of precision stretches credibility. Engineers attempting to replicate ancient methods have found copper too soft to leave clean incisions in granite, the hardest material used in the pyramid's core. The saws dull quickly, the chisels deform. Experiments leave rough grooves rather than the polished symmetry seen inside the chambers. Still, the mainstream story continues. Patience, skill, and endless manpower overcame those limits. That notion comforts us. It places human achievement on a steady slope, from village huts to empires, from stone tools to silicon chips. The pyramid fits perfectly into this ladder of progress. It looks like the moment humanity graduated from instinct to intellect. And yet, there are gaps large enough to admit doubt. No contemporary inscription, no record carved by Khufu himself, declares him the builder. The only link is those red marks discovered nearly 4,500 years later, painted, not carved, and strangely inconsistent with known glyph standards of his time. Some researchers have quietly noted that the pigment sits on a surface inaccessible until modern explorers broke through. If those marks were truly ancient, they would have been sealed beneath, unseen since construction. But skepticism seldom wins against tradition when the story already feels complete. Beside this question of authorship stands the logistical challenge. Construction diagrams propose massive ramps extending hundreds of meters from the pyramid's base, made of mud brick and limestone fill, strong enough to drag stones weighing up to 80 tons. But the material needed to build such ramps would rival the pyramid itself in scale, and there are no clear remains of them. Archaeological surveys have found fragments of causeways and quarried paths, yet nothing that matches the vast infrastructure the theory demands. Some variations attempt spiraling ramps hugging the pyramid sides. Others propose small internal stairways hidden within. Each idea satisfies one problem but raises another. With every refinement, the story bends slightly to preserve its foundation. The human evidence, though tangible, offers mixed signals. South of the pyramid, excavations revealed a cluster of workers' quarters, bakeries, storage pits, and simple limestone huts. These finds are often held up as proof of the great labor force loyal to Khufu. Animal bones there suggest diets richer than those of common farmers, implying skilled workers rather than slaves. On the surface, this confirms the narrative of a vast organized workforce. The deeper dating of the ash layers and pottery tells a subtler story. Occupations stretched across generations, maintenance teams repairing, rebuilding, or performing rituals long after the supposed 20-year construction window closed. What looks like evidence of one empire's project may instead echo centuries of continuity at a sacred site older than recorded kingship itself. The official interpretation, however, resists ambiguity. In galleries and textbooks, Khufu's pyramid is presented with crisp clarity. Laborers hauling blocks under the sun, overseers tallying resources, priests sanctifying progress. That repetition, the same visuals, the same language, cements belief more powerfully than the stones ever could. When a narrative repeats long enough, it becomes architecture in its own right. Each retelling adds another layer of mortar, sealing cracks before anyone looks too closely. The perfection of the structure in collective memory mirrors the precision of the monument itself. Still, there is a faint rattle under that surface. The absence of carved dedication inside the pyramid contrasts sharply with the Egyptian custom. Pharaohs elsewhere filled their tombs with inscriptions to celebrate their deeds, to ensure their identity would not dissolve in sand. Even minor officials left marks. Khufu, uniquely, leaves nothing but disputed red paint in an inaccessible chamber. For a ruler known to assert his power through architecture, that muteness feels deliberate, or perhaps it predates him entirely. Others dismiss such speculation as romanticism, preferring the cleaner timeline. Yet the puzzle endures. Why does the pyramid speak so little for the king who supposedly raised it? When the sun climbs high over Giza, shadows sharpen and details re-emerge. The base platform, sprawling over 13 acres, remains level to within 2 centimeters, an exactness beyond the reach of rudimentary sightline. Modern builders, with lasers and instruments, find that balancing act difficult even today. The structure's load-bearing design, particularly the sequence of relieving chambers above the main vault, shows a grasp of forces that implies more than trial and error. To accept that this knowledge rose spontaneously within a single reign demands a faith in human improvisation bordering on miracle. Still, the textbooks hold the line. The pyramid, they insist, mark civilization's growth from mud huts to majesty. This conviction grew strong not merely because it worked, but because it resonated with a larger myth, the Western idea of progress as linear ascent. From this view, Egypt's grandeur symbolizes humanity's awakening. The massive ramp, the copper chisel, the disciplined workforce, together they mirror industrial logic before its time. It feels rational, intelligible, safe to admire. In that framework, the pyramid isn't a mystery to solve. It's a monument to keep us believing that effort alone conquers nature. That belief has weight in classrooms and exhibition halls, where stories of mastery reassure audiences that history always moves forward. But the ground beneath such reassurance is uneven. When engineers walk the plateau and feel the exact line of the base under their boots, some sense the paradox. A structure both primitive and elegant, its precision hard to reconcile with the suggested tools. A few whisper that what we call explanation might be reconstruction, a pattern written later upon fragments of an older tale. The same way restorers repaint faded murals, we might have painted meaning over older intent, mistaking inheritance for invention. None of this erases the power of the accepted history. It has guided generations of study, inspired architecture, and defined Egypt in the public mind. Yet, the more tightly it's held, the more intriguing its blind spots become. History, like these stones, can be dressed to hide its joints. Where facts align too tidily, suspicion naturally enters. Consider how each challenging discovery, misaligned dates, unexplained erosion, missing inscriptions, has often been absorbed, reclassified, or quietly set aside. The official story endures intact because it provides coherence, not because it answers every question. That is the elegance and the fragility of consensus. It's easy to picture a young archaeologist in the 1920s brushing dust from a limestone fragment, while the supervisor notes distances in the glare of noon. They aren't searching for secrets, only for proof that the narrative in their textbooks matches the ground beneath them. Each measurement becomes confirmation rather than inquiry. Gradually, the myth of completion replaces the practice of curiosity. The monument stands immovable, both as architecture and as story. The desert wind at Giza doesn't argue. It simply dusts over whatever version endures longest. The pyramid's polished casing once reflected sunlight so brilliantly that ancient writers called it the shining stone. Most of that outer layer was stripped away centuries ago for building materials, leaving the rougher core exposed. Perhaps the historical narrative has undergone a similar extraction, stripped of its irregularities until only a simplified skeleton remains. What was lost with those bright surfaces might be as significant as what still stands. After all, clarity can conceal as effectively as shadow, especially when it becomes a heritage item in its own right. So the official story of Khufu's monument gleams, refined, symmetrical, satisfying. It shows humanity mastering mathematics, nature, and death in a single act. But behind its fine polish are seams filled with sand, moments of uncertainty smoothed over by repetition. The excavation of truth in history rarely happens with chisels. It happens when the light slants differently, revealing the texture beneath the familiar. And here on the plateau, under wind that still hums through stone corners, those hidden textures whisper briefly before fading back into quiet. For now, the narrative holds its shape, yet as we trace its edges the surface begins to tremble, not from time, but from attention. The next question rises like heat from the stones beneath our feet. If this story isn't as solid as we thought, where do the first cracks appear? In a quiet corner of the Cairo Museum, behind glass clouded by time, rests a slab of limestone scarcely a meter tall. Its edges are torn like parchment, its face is worn smooth by centuries of handling. Yet the faint hieroglyphs across it still hold a coherence. A story that shifts the calendar of Egypt itself. This relic is known as the inventory stele, and though it appears harmless, its message unsettles the ground beneath the accepted tale of Egypt's old kingdom. Most museum placards frame it as an artifact from the late period, a curiosity of faith rather than a document of fact. But the words cut deeper. They speak of Pharaoh Khufu not building the Sphinx, but finding it already half-buried and venerating it as something ancient. According to the inscription, Khufu came upon the house of Isis, mistress of the pyramid, and ordered offerings to be placed before a temple that had already stood. In the language of Egyptian kingship, that phrasing is unorthodox, borderline heretical. Pharaohs did not honor pre-existing sanctuaries as if they were tenants. They built new ones, layered their names atop old devotion, and claimed the role of divine originators. This text, in contrast, presents Khufu as a kind of caretaker in a landscape older than his own reign. It implies succession rather than creation, a civilization already weathered before the dynastic world began recording its own story. The usual rhythm of royal inscriptions pulses with verbs of power. I founded, I raised, I conquered. The inventory stele murmurs in a humbler tone. The script's curving lines describe the uncovering of something forgotten, its tone more referential than victorious. Within its damaged surface there's mention of vanished temples and of statues standing before the Sphinx, long before Khufu's workers could have carved them. It's the sort of text that should have redrawn Egypt's timeline, yet it was quietly shelved as a religious fiction, explained away as a product from a time when older myths were revived to lend priests legitimacy. Critics frame it as late propaganda from the 26th dynasty, around 2,000 years after Khufu lived, created to attract pilgrims by connecting their local goddess Isis to the sanctity of Giza's plateau. Still, the idea that a priestly order fabricated a document solely to rewrite origins invites its own questions. If the stele were an invention, why craft it with such specific oddities, naming Khufu not as builder but as restorer, and situating the Sphinx in a time already ancient to him? Why risk contradicting canonical theology that crowned the king as the source of divine order? Supporters suggest the text simply recorded an oral memory, something handed down from pre-dynastic times, codified long after the fact when Egypt's sands had hidden all physical proof. Others dismiss it as a pious story with no historical grounding. The truth, as ever, breathes somewhere between ink and intention. You can almost feel the air thickening when the stone's translation is read aloud. The cadence of words that shouldn't exist side by side. Khufu and Isis, the practical engineer king and the eternal magician. Their overlap feels improbable. Yet there it is, etched in mineral certainty. The stele intertwines them through a tone of devotion rather than invention, suggesting that the pyramid itself served a function not exclusively funerary. Isis, usually tied to rebirth and cosmic balance, is here called the mistress of the pyramid. That title alone suggests layers of meaning lost to Orthodox theology. No other pyramid text links a deity so directly to the structure's physical fabric. It hints that the monument, even in Khufu's era, might have been revered not as a tomb, but as an instrument of divine communication or regeneration, a relic of something unfathomably earlier. When Auguste Mariette unearthed the limestone in 1858, the discovery was almost accidental. His team was excavating near the Sphinx temple, clearing debris from a cluster of smaller shrines when the fragments surfaced. The afternoon was hot enough to sting, the metal tools leaving thin trails of dust through the sunlight. Mariette crouched beside his foreman, brushed the sand gently from the carved lines. He could not have known that he had uncovered a document that would decades later become more famous for its dismissal than its discovery. The artifact went into crates among routine finds, broken statuary, amulets, fragments of cartouches, and it was only after translation in Cairo that its peculiar phrasing drew notice. For a moment it seemed to offer a revelation about dynastic memory. Then, just as swiftly, it was reclassified as myth. The reasoning for that rejection now sits in journals and museum catalogs. The craftsmanship of the hieroglyphs appeared later than Khufu's time. The composition matched later stylistic norms. The theme echoed known late-period revival texts, all neat checkmarks. Yet taken together, they also mirror the symptoms of something copied, or consciously preserved, from an older model. Modern restorations sometimes bear later tool marks, because the copyist worked centuries after the original was lost. What if the stele we see is itself a copy of an ancient reference, transcribed in a later temple where the meaning had already faded but the reverence remained? Its broken top invites that speculation. The upper section is gone, snapped clean away long before Mariette's men found it. Scholars note that the missing portion almost certainly contained the opening dedication, the names of builders, and perhaps the precise date of the tale. The absence transforms the inscription into a riddle. If the break was accidental, it was an unlucky one. If deliberate, it removed the single key that could confirm or destroy its testimony. Some whisper that the damage looks too surgically placed to be random. Others counter that weathering and reuse were common in temple construction. The stele's lines offer just enough to ask and not enough to answer. For traditional Egyptology, these irregularities are not troubling. They fit neatly into the category of religious nostalgia. For fringe theorists, they are sparks of something older, a message left within the bureaucratic prose of priests. Perhaps the inventory stele represents a memory of an age when the Sphinx and the pyramids already line the horizon, markers from a civilization swallowed by shifting climate or rising Nile floods long before documentary history began. Such an idea unsettles timelines that depend on upward progress from simple to complex. It injects an element of inheritance, implying that Egypt did not invent grandeur, but inherited its stage props from forgotten predecessors. Mariette himself seldom lived to see that argument unfold. He died in 1881, buried not far from his discoveries. His notes describe the find plainly, without speculation. But reading between the lines, one can sense quiet admiration toward the stone's storytelling. The fragment intrigued him more for its literary grace than its historical claim. Later scholars largely ignored those early impressions, preferring the certainty of chronology to the vagueness of myth. But the human moment remains vivid, a French archaeologist bending over a half-buried stone, sunlight flickering off the dust, feeling history tug in two directions, faith and evidence on one side, the impossibility of coincidence on the other. Over time, the steel's words have acquired a second life outside academia, circulating through alternative history circles, whispered on late-night broadcasts, cited in books that question mainstream chronology. Yet even beyond speculation, its factual strangeness holds weight. Egyptian kings rarely, if ever, wrote themselves as restorers. It was a reversal of divine order. The text does so not once, but several times, emphasizing repairs, dedications, and offerings, as if to underline that Khufu's role was maintenance rather than invention. The pattern of phrasing reads like a confession preserved under ceremonial veneer. It's this inversion of pride that continues to fascinate those who study it, even when they accept its late date. Each visitor drawn to the stele brings a private bias. Some see poetry, others deception, and a few glimpses of ancient science concealed within ritual language. The truth is probably tangled among them, the mixing of records across centuries, myth grafted over memoir, copyists who half understood the text they carved. Yet that layering itself tells a story, a civilization perpetually rewriting its own birth. The inventory stele stands as a kind of palimpsest where belief and archaeology graze against each other, neither canceling the other out completely. What remains undeniable is the emotional residue in the language, the reverence for something older, pronounced in careful glyphs that resist erosion even now. Those carvings imply continuity, not sudden innovation. Perhaps Egypt's builders saw themselves as guardians of techniques already ancient, refined rather than invented. Such continuity could explain the sudden precision of the Old Kingdom's monuments, their geometry, their unerring alignments, their blend of spirituality and engineering unmatched by later eras. If Khufu truly restored a temple beside a buried sphinx, he was not inaugurating Egypt's golden age, but preserving fragments of one threatened by oblivion. The broken head of the stele slopes in such a way that light from the museum's ceiling lamps catches only half its hieroglyphs at once. Stand a little to the side and the lines darken, the goddess name vanishing into the limestone's grain. It's almost allegorical, the evidence visible only from a narrow angle, disappearing if you try to grasp it wholly. For anyone looking to confirm or dismiss the mystery outright, that effect offers a quiet lesson. Sometimes the paradox isn't in the data but in how we choose to frame it. Beyond the museum walls, the streets stir with Cairo's late traffic, horns pulsing like scattered drums. Inside, the ancient stone rests indifferent to both belief and denial. Whether late forgery or genuine echo from prehistory, its words pry open the foundations of a timeline repeated so often, it has become reflex. The stele forces a small pause, a momentary reevaluation of what ancient actually means. If Khufu indeed found the Sphinx already buried in sand, the distance between myth and record narrows to a whisper. In that whisper, an older Egypt seems to breathe, one predating the pharaohs who claimed eternity as their right. It surfaces only faintly through gaps and breaks, through reverent verbs instead of grandiose declarations. And through that quiet persistence, the inventory stele leaves us with a single, uneasy impression. Perhaps the builders we celebrate were only later occupants of a legacy already thousands of years old, their monuments rising over footprints we no longer see. You stand before the Sphinx enclosure. The light catches on limestone that bends like the trace of an old wave, its surface drawn into scallops and hollows that ripple down the wall. The air carries that faint powdery smell of dust after a warm wind. From a distance, the monument looks eternal. Up close, it feels fragile, its curves recalling seasons that should not belong in a desert this dry. Geologist Robert Schoch once climbed into this trench with a notepad and a small hammer. The afternoon sun burned against the rim above him as he sketched bands of wear, deep vertical channels that dropped from the ledge like softened rain marks. He saw something different from what most archaeologists saw. To him, this wasn't the work of sand or wind. It was the mark of rainfall, steady and ancient, falling for thousands of years before any pharaoh ruled. He followed the irregular patterns down the enclosure wall, noting how they rounded into smooth troughs, instead of the sharp, horizontal scrape that windswept grains usually leave. Each groove told a geological story that pointed to a world long before the Old Kingdom, when heavy storms still lingered over North Africa. The conclusion unsettled official timelines. Khafar's era, when the Sphinx is said to have been carved, belonged to a climate that could no longer summon that kind of rain. By that point, the Sahara had hardened into its familiar dryness, a sea of dust with only brief scattered showers. The channels that Schock traced required centuries of persistent downpour. Critics offered alternatives: wind erosion, salt crystallization, seeping groundwater, but he compared those explanations with their typical erosion signatures and found a mismatch. Wind digs sideways, cutting horizontal striations. Salt leaves pitted scars where crystals burst out from within. Rising groundwater wears rock unevenly near the base. None of those patterns matched the tall, rounded furrows running like melted candle wax along the Sphinx enclosure. Kneeling at the western wall, Schock ran his fingers across the stone-softened edge. It had the texture of weather once alive with water. The smoothness suggested years of liquid movement rather than the biting grit of sandstorms. Around him, sounds seemed to vanish. Even the calls from above came muffled by the depth of the pit. He was standing inside evidence of a climate that had ended millennia earlier, one that transformed the Sahara into a savanna of reeds and rainfall. If the Sphinx had been sculpted then, its builders belonged to a forgotten world, the threshold between Ice Age and Empire. Others counter that geology alone can deceive. They argue that partial burial across ages, chemical leaching, or human restoration could mimic those same curves. Egypt's cycles of flood and drought repeatedly buried the Sphinx up to its neck, letting moisture accumulate in the lower layers. Groundwater might have softened the stone, they say, even in the absence of consistent rainfall. Yet the upper portions eroded too, where water tables could never reach. The continuity of wear from crown to base remains difficult to reconcile with simple seepage. Debate hardened quickly in the early 1990s when Schock presented his findings. Egyptologists asked why no earlier civilization left tools, texts, or tombs to accompany such a vast creation. If it predated Khafar, where were its neighbors? Schock responded that the monument itself might be the only survivor of a much older culture, erased by climatic change. The rains that carved its walls may also have destroyed everything built from wood or mud. The Sphinx could be a geological palimpsest, shaped by hands from one epoch, repaired by another, and claimed by many. As the sun dropped lower, the trench glowed honey gold. Within that light, the differing ages of repair stood out. Blocks added later appeared brighter, smoother. The original bedrock beneath them was darkened and rounded as if softened by touch. Under centuries of restoration, you can read a stratigraphy not just of stone, but of human memory, every layer testifying to another attempt to preserve what had already outlasted empires. Supporters of the rainfall theory point to the scale of those storms and what they suggest about the continent's transformation. Geological records show that northern Africa once pulsed with lakes and grasslands, teeming with wildlife. Rock art from the Libyan desert depicts giraffes and river boats. If the Sphinx's body formed under that sky, then its origin reaches back to a time when glaciers were retreating from Europe and humans first began receding the Nile Valley. In that sense, the monument could stand at the intersection of climate and consciousness, a boundary marker where memory of the old wet world lingered in myth. The absence of a builder's name only deepens the quiet unease around its age. No contemporary inscription attributes it directly to Khafre. The nearby temples and causeways bear no declaration of authorship. Later texts describe restoration, not construction. The oldest praise songs speak of the Sphinx as an already ancient guardian. Its alignment, carved straight into the native bedrock, points toward the rising sun with a precision that suggests inherited tradition rather than momentary design. Some whisper that the head, smaller in proportion to the body, was recut from a much earlier image, its face reshaped to fit the ruler of a later dynasty. If true, even its expression might belong to more than one era layered into a single stare. Critics counter with the strength of cultural continuity that Egypt's artisans inherited quarrying skills over generations and could easily replicate older weathering patterns. Yet measurements from the enclosure show not replication but contradiction. Stones cut from identical limestone beds for Khafre's nearby temple remain sharply edged. The Sphinx's deeper walls, made of the same material, look as though centuries of rain had brushed them into folds. The contrast sits only meters apart in plain sight, an argument carved by nature rather than chisels. Schock's interpretation did more than challenge a date. It lit an argument about how we choose what evidence counts. Archaeology leans on artifacts. Geology speaks through pattern and process. Their partnership usually reinforces history, but here they seem to diverge. In the slow rhythm of erosion, the Sphinx carried a memory that the written record declined to share. The tension between these two testimonies, the silence of the stone and the caution of academia, still hums beneath every photograph and tourist guide. In recent years, the debate has quieted at the surface, though newer imaging technologies continue to confirm the depth of the weathered channels. Water once fell here in large volume, long before Khafre's time. Whether that rain sculpted the monument directly or worked on older rock faces before carving began remains an open question. Either way, the geology forces time backward, pressing the age of the Sphinx against the outer edge of civilization itself. If rainfall once poured through this desert, then the Sahara we know is a relatively modern chapter. Scholars mapping ancient lake beds find patterns of human occupation reaching deep into prehistory. Villages once dotted the banks of giant paleo lakes, their pottery shards still bearing traces of fish and cattle migration. When drought returned, the people followed water back toward the Nile. Perhaps some among them, descendants of these lake dwellers, carved the guardian that now watches sunrise after sunrise through a world that forgot their name. Kneeling in the trench that day, Schock brushed granules from the groove of the stone, then paused as a thin gust rolled sand across his notes. He wrote until the light failed and the walls around him turned the color of tarnished bronze. Above him, the lion's face remained impassive, eyes fixed eastward toward a horizon it had been studying for thousands of years. When the first stars appeared, the contours that looked like soft rain marks in daylight faded into shadow, leaving only the darkness of the pit and the faint trace of wind. Across the desert night settles without sound, but through that stillness comes a thought that lingers. If these walls remember rainfall, then they remember a climate old enough to rewrite Egypt's story. The Sphinx, half buried for most of recorded history, may not just watch the dawn. It may have watched glaciers melt, rivers vanish, and the sky itself change color. And if the surface speaks in such unfamiliar tones, then beneath it, under layers untouched for millennia, what else might wait? The next secret may not stand in open desert light at all, but lies sealed in darkness beneath the plateau where stone gives way to hollow space and the story of origin deepens once more. Floodlights carve narrow cones through dust as a winch lowers a rope into a fissure near Khafre's causeway. The air grows cooler with each meter, brushed by a faint mineral breath that seems far older than the pyramids above. Beneath the plateau, the Osiris shaft drops more than 30 meters into the limestone, a descent through layers that feel less like construction and more like memory. The first platform is cramped, barely enough space for a worker to crouch beside the rope pulley. Below that, the rock opens into a chamber where shallow water gathers, mirroring the glow of headlamps as the explorers steady their footing. The surface trembles each time a tool hits stone, but the sound vanishes before it can echo. Beyond the flooded level lies a deeper vault. Here, the limestone walls turn smooth, almost glassy under touch. The third chamber is taller than the others, its floor grated by carved niches large enough to hold a person standing upright. At the center sits an unmarked stone box, heavy red granite drawn from quarries, hundreds of kilometers south. It bears no names, no images of gods or kings, nothing to stake a claim of lineage. Some whisper it was once a sarcophagus, though there are no traces of burial, no hint of offerings or resin or linen ash. The interior is clean, its corners precise down to the width of a thumbnail. Those who have entered speak of the strange acoustics. Quiet voices seem to stretch clear across the room, while any louder sound folds back and dulls, as though the walls were tuned to absorb force instead of reflect it. A worker once dropped a wrench on the floor and heard no clatter, only a soft vibration that ran beneath his boots. Supporters suggest this space might have been crafted to shape sound, a chamber built for resonance rather than rest. In that sense, it may have served as an instrument of ritual, or even a measure of frequency in stone. Critics counter that the effect comes from the natural density of the granite, not careful design, yet the geometry feels deliberate. The box stands aligned to the niches, as if every wall were part of a larger pattern. Rising back to the surface brings only a partial relief. The darkness below does not end with that chamber. Modern ground-penetrating radar, first used here in the early 2000s and refined through much of the decade, revealed additional voids beneath the site, zones with edges too clean to be natural fractures. Layered volumes appear beneath both the Sphinx and sections of the Great Pyramid itself. Some readings suggest networks of corridors looping under the plateau, their shapes hinting at stairways or sealed portals connecting levels we have yet to breach. Reports surfaced of voids arranged in geometric clusters, as if following an older blueprint invisible on the ground above. Official statements insist that these irregularities are minor, no more than cracks or dried channels left by groundwater. Yet technicians who performed the scan spoke of consistent returns from solid bedrock, indicating the cavities were deliberate. Later, muon imaging, using cosmic particles to read mass through limestone, mapped faint, empty regions that aligned with the radar data almost exactly. Still, public access was closed soon after. The maps, when released, were cropped to reveal little more than grayscale shadows. For a brief period, scientific teams proposed to send small drones through pre-existing shafts, but permission evaporated before the plans matured. The reason given was safety, though rumor followed that heritage authorities sought to protect national symbols from speculation. A few researchers left the voice recordings describing what they had seen before the floodlights dimmed. Hand-sized doorways cut into rock, too smooth to belong to any known excavation. One described pressing his fingers against a seam that trembled as though air moved behind it. His transmission fractured halfway through, and when it returned, his only words were measurements. These tunnels are not uniform in design. The upper shafts near the Great Pyramid angle inward, suggesting they might converge toward a central axis. Others curve outward, following the bedrock's natural slope toward what would once have been the Nile. It gives an impression of controlled flow, almost hydraulic, though no markings identify purpose. When early workers lowered instruments into the water-filled section of the Osiris shaft, they found the depth irregular, as if a lower corridor had collapsed and sealed itself with sediment. Later, drilling confirmed that beneath the main level lies another hollow, its dimensions roughly matching the chamber above yet containing finer limestone untouched by flood or air. It is still unreachable. In quiet moments, The engineers who descend there describe a certain weight pressing from every direction. Not physical mass, but a sense of enclosure that amplifies heartbeat and breath. The radio feed captures their words fading out mid-sentence, swallowed by the medium itself. Down here, time feels thick. The rock has a voice of its own, slow, patient, unbothered by our brief presence. Supporters suggest the plateau might not just host the pyramids, but be a single engineered landscape, a repository cut from stone to hide something beneath dynastic history. Critics dismiss this as imagination, saying such voids form naturally under limestone. Still, the symmetry unsettles simple explanation. The geometry above mirrors the rumor below. Each of the three main pyramids rests roughly along a diagonal that runs northeast to southwest, parallel to the underlying fissures detected by radar. The pattern repeats at smaller scales, like a printed code stamped through rock and earth alike. If these hollows truly predate construction, then the pyramid builders may have encountered them and simply built atop existing foundations, inheriting rather than designing. The thought lingers that the visible monuments might be surface markers of a more extensive system, the way a temple spire indicates a city beneath. Some legends recorded in nearby villages speak of tunnels wide enough for boats, echoing ancient descriptions of the underworld beneath Memphis, or the vault of Zep Tepi the first time. Most archaeologists treat those as myths layered with poetic metaphor, yet the consistency of the imagery draws attention. The people who told such stories lived close enough to the plateau to witness its subtle shifts, the way stormwater vanished into crevices and never returned, the steady hum that travelers once claimed could be heard at certain nights when wind flowed through narrow passages. Even in modern times, when generators line the tourist paths, reports of odd reverberations persist. A local guard in 2015 described hearing a deep pulse from the ground after sunset, rhythmic enough to make gravel tremble under his boots. Instruments later registered a trace vibration, but engineers attributed it to stabilizing machinery from nearby works. That explanation satisfied no one who had stood there. The ground itself seemed to breathe, pulling air through unseen veins. When news of the radar scans leaked, attention turned briefly to what officials would not confirm. Charts showing grids of small dots were circulated online, labeled Cavity 1 through Cavity 7. The data lacked scale, yet each line corresponded to measured depth intervals that matched miners' reports from the 19th century. When early diggers broke into hollow pockets near the base of Khufu's pyramid and quickly sealed them again after accidents in the sand. Such repetitions across time create their own whisper, a pattern of discovery and concealment repeating at regular intervals, as though directed by the site itself. From ground level, tourists see only limestone and light, yet underneath, pools still collect at the lowest chamber of the Osiris shaft, fed by moisture that emerges despite the desert climate. The water level neither rises nor drains fully, sustained at a quiet equilibrium. It reflects the narrow beam of any incoming light perfectly, so that standing at the edge you appear twice, once above, once below. For those who work there, it becomes difficult to decide which world is the original and which the reflection. Supporters of a pre-dynastic origin point to the machining precision of the granite box and to the absence of inscriptions typical of later burials. Critics answer that its emptiness proves nothing, that incomplete tombs existed elsewhere in Egypt, yet the box's orientation, lying east-west rather than north-south like pharaonic coffins, continues to invite speculation. One theory claims such alignment served an acoustic rather than ritual function, placing it at a resonant node of the chamber where sound gathers and folds inward. Experiments with tone generators in recent years did reveal unusual amplification at certain frequencies, though whether it was intentional remains unproven. These underground features hint at planning beyond visible architecture. If the surface monuments celebrated celestial precision, the alignment to stars or solstices, then perhaps the chambers below recorded something terrestrial, sound, water, or data of another kind preserved in geometry itself. Structural mapping indicates that parts of the plateau have hollow densities consistent with large engineered volumes, yet verification awaits excavation no one seems eager to authorize. Restrictions tighten each year, sealing entry to shafts once open to limited inspections. Still, those who study the site know that absence is itself a form of information. Every blocked passage, every sudden halt of effort sketches the boundaries of a story we are not yet allowed to read. A pattern of revelation followed by retreat plays out again and again. Measurements appear, excitement builds, documentation quiets. The plateau listens indifferent. Above this hidden network, the desert looks smooth and unbroken, yet the ground is alive with voids that mimic order. Maybe they served as drainage or staging spaces or something beyond our measure. The granite box waits at the center of its drowned chamber, angles exact, still echoing the faint hum of its own frequency after so many centuries. If these cavities were carved with purpose, then the visible pyramids may be only the coverstones of a map buried in bedrock, a map that records not death, but design. Up above that design seems to continue in another language. The plateau surface, when viewed from the air, forms a diagram that mirrors ratios found in the pyramid geometry itself, as though what lies beneath feeds the plan above. The idea unsettles as quietly as it fascinates, that Egypt's true monument might not reach upward toward the sun, but inward into the dark folds of the earth. And as the floodlights above the shaft switch off one by one, that dark waits undisturbed, ready perhaps to speak in geometry again when someone finally listens. Under afternoon light, the Great Pyramid loses its edges. The stone warms to a dull glow, and what was once geometry begins to behave like something else. Its lines pull the eye upward while the body feels the pull outward, across a base equal on every side. When measured in meters, its perimeter stretches near 921.6, and its height before erosion rises close to 146.6. Divide one by the other and an odd echo appears, 6.2857, a breath from 2 pi, a circle hidden in a square. Its builder, whoever they were, folded into the desert a constant that defines motion itself. At this angle, the pyramid stops being masonry and starts speaking mathematics. Surveyors running their lasers along its north face note that the alignment to true north misses by about 0.05 degrees, a difference so fine that even modern compasses waver more. The base is level to a variance of barely 2 centimeters, though it sits upon uneven bedrock. Each side, once polished in white Tura limestone, would have reflected sunlight so sharply that sailors on the Nile saw it as a fixed star on Earth. That degree of straightness, that placement facing cardinal directions, suggests intent as much as craftsmanship. There's structure here, but also message. Supporters of deeper meaning point to the ratios embedded in that angle of slope, roughly 51.84 degrees. It appears to whisper another constant, the golden proportion, a relationship found in shells, branches, and galaxies. Phi is what pattern reuses when it wants to repeat beautifully. In the pyramid's rise, the ratio of base to height follows its curve, suggesting someone aware not only of symmetry, but of harmony. Yet, official accounts trace the math to chance alignment and the practical need for structural stability. When questioned, some engineers admit that structure alone cannot explain such precision. Coincidence, they say, often arrives only after long calculation. Others look higher, beyond the scaffolds and stones, to what those ancient builders used for navigation, like from the sky itself. To face true north with such accuracy without a compass requires stellar measurement. And in the 4th millennium BCE, north was marked not by Polaris, but by a pair of stars revolving around an earlier pole. To mirror that turn within microns of correctness is to track heaven's drift, night after night, over a generation. The pyramid becomes the frozen endpoint of sky's motion, a monument calibrated not just to Earth, but to the rotation of the heavens. There's a quiet fascination in how numbers appear here, almost chemically bonded to the structure. Each layer of stone multiplies into ratio, each ratio unfolds toward constant. Some whisper that whoever designed it wasn't marking death or divinity, but encoding a key, a scale model of the planet itself. Multiply the pyramid's height by the number 43,200, and you arrive at 6,272 kilometers, close to the radius of Earth from pole to center. By the same factor, its base perimeter expands to match Earth's circumference at the equator. For those drawn to mystery, such consistency can't be brushed off as aesthetics. It feels deliberate, perhaps generational, knowledge drawn from long observation rather than invention. Critics counter that this kind of numerology collects coincidences like dust. Measure enough monuments, they say, and one or two will accidentally fit cosmic rules. The mind seeks order and congratulates itself when it finds patterns. In their view, the ratio to pi emerged not from design, but as a consequence of the pyramid's practical slant, chosen for stability and volume. Yet that stability could have been achieved through countless other angles. To land on one that mirrors the mathematics of circles may be luck, or the residue of intuition so old we no longer have words for it. Some engineers pause before calling it luck. They point to how ancient masons seem to have laid each side, beginning from the center outward, with ropes drawn taut by small trenches cut at perfect intervals. Those guiding trenches act almost like a drafting set scaled to stone. If you kneel close to the base, the remaining marks read as faint geometry, craft meeting concept. Perhaps they didn't know pi by name, but they knew it through experience, the ratio where everything built around a center returns to itself. A mason need not name a law to obey it. Consider the view from above, rising on the flow of warm air that ripples over Giza at sunset. The Great Pyramid, stripped of casing, reveals 12 faint seams where corners once caught the sun. From that height, its four faces form 8, marking equinox and solstice with mathematical grace. The play of angle and shadow might have been deliberate, a way of measuring time through geometry. Heliacal rising of stars, the balance of days, the invisible path of precession. These were not abstract to them. They were lived, tracked with sight and rope rather than theory. It's one thing to shape stone, it's another to capture movement within it. The pyramid's design folds planetary constants into its profile, the way a fingerprint folds identity into whorl and ridge. Every measurement, base, height, slope relates to something larger than itself. Some see these proportions as remnants of an older science that preceded hieroglyphs, an inheritance passed down rather than discovered anew. They imagine the builders as translators working from template centuries, maybe millennia older. Others dismiss that lineage and point instead to human persistence, generation after generation, refining simple methods until they struck accidental perfection. In either case, the structure resists conformity. The more closely engineers and mathematicians measure it, the more intricacies unfold. Each side once extended to 230 meters, yet corners meet with precision within centimeters. Diagonals deviate across the span of a football field by less than the width of a thumb. At this scale, perfection feels almost biological, as if the stone itself grew into form. The effect unsettles those who expect ancient errors. It suggests observation practiced to obsession, experiment repeated for decades until the pattern held. There's an old story told among local workers that the stones were tuned before final placement. Each was nudged by sound, a low percussion made by bronze poles tapping in measured rhythm. While archaeology finds no proof of this, the notion carries an odd symbolic truth, resonance shaping order. The geometry hums with that same quiet vibration, a feeling that what we see as mass is, at another scale, frequency frozen solid. Whether by intuition or calculation, the lines capture motion and stillness at once. If one walks around the base today with modern instruments, The readings agree on the mystery, a deviation too small to be humanly casual. Even with mechanical guidance, construction of such scale would demand a continuous recalibration beyond ancient known tools. The copper chisels in museums, the wooden sledges in textbooks, they seem modest against results so keen. Some modern masons have attempted small reconstructions with those means and found tolerances slip away within meters. Yet the pyramid holds alignment across hectares, unyielding after thousands of years of quakes and heat. Perhaps the wonder lies not in physics but psychology. The builders may have married sacred intent with engineering so closely that the outcome reflects both faith and formula. They followed the laws of harmony because they believed creation itself did. In that sense, pi and phi were less numbers than prayers, geometries recited into stone. Each block placed was an act of devotion as much as design, a material language describing balance, eternity, return. These constants would have been felt, not named. Still, the numerical elegance draws modern minds back to speculation. To some, the equation suggests that the pyramid served as a model of transformation, a visual bridge between linear life and circular eternity. To others, it reflects the legacy of even earlier surveyors who mapped the planet using long-forgotten instruments. Theories multiply and each rests on the same fascination, geometry that seems to know more than it should. Critics warn that correlation is not cause, yet they also concede the achievement's rarity. Few ancient works, even those purposefully geometric, hold so tightly to mathematical truth. An Egyptian stonemason at the site today, trimming restoration pieces near the southern base, wipes limestone dust from his hands before speaking to a visitor. He says he feels no surprise at the number scientists find inside the pyramid's layout. If you want something to live forever, he says, you build it by the laws of the world, not by the plans of men. His quiet measure falls somewhere between poetry and engineering, a bridge across time. The debate around intent continues in academic halls, online archives, and whispered discussions between physicists who travel to Giza out of personal fascination rather than research grant. Some bring portable magnetometers, others carry notebooks filled with ratios and sketches. Regardless of their approach, the same impression lingers, precision out of step with its era, as if the builders glimpsed relationships later formalized in the language of calculus. The numbers predate notation, carved into existence before symbols could define them. At night the pyramid cools. The air above it flickers with the last heat leaving stone. A modern surveyor, leaning against his tripod, logs one final reading. His device chirps, recording an alignment error so small it stirs a laugh he barely lets out. He cannot tell whether he's found proof of genius or of his own calibration's limits. Either way, the desert takes the sound and folds it into distance. Down in the tourist paths, flashlights spark briefly before being buried again under stars patterned much like equations. Those who pursue meaning in this architecture tread between two lights, one cast by evidence, the other by imagination. The pyramid's exactitude tempts both, asking whether we've mistaken monument for instrument. Its base mirrors planetary spin, its faces track the solar year with silent precision. Maybe these are side effects of devotion to order, or maybe, encoded beneath the equations, there's purpose we haven't recognized yet. A reason why stone would want to remember the laws of light and motion. Whether by science or chance, the geometry continues to whisper across centuries. Some researchers see only the outcome of masterful surveying, others hear a deeper voice, as if the pyramid were reciting mathematics back to the stars it once followed. Either way, the effect is undeniable. Under moonlight it appears both eerily simple and impossibly refined, a structure that measures the world even as it outlasts our efforts to define it. Such precision leaves one lingering uncertainty. If numbers form the skeleton of belief, then perhaps belief itself guided the tools, making the stones move according to rules as yet unnamed. That thought lingers like static in the air around the monument. And from this still geometry, another question begins to draw breath. If meaning shaped these numbers, what function might have shaped them too? In the cool hollow of the pyramid's heart, the ceiling presses down from a space cut with edges too exact to feel human. Here stands the granite box, deep red when the light touches it, mute as a stone bell when it does not. It stands alone, without lid or carving, its surfaces meeting at corners so true they almost seem drawn, with a ruler that measured the world itself. The chamber smells faintly of dust and mineral. The air is thin, carrying the dry scent of crushed quartz, where centuries of visitors have brushed their palms. What survives isn't a name or a body, but an object that looks as if it was designed for precision rather than mourning. The box's craftsmanship is staggering. Each face runs flat across its length, with tolerances measured within fractions of a millimeter. The interior corners are clean, not chipped, as though carved by pressure rather than abrasion. Archaeologists estimate that this granite was quarried far to the south at Aswan, hundreds of kilometers away, and ferried down the Nile. Transporting a block of that scale, cut, polished, and still uncracked, would be a logistical dance few modern cranes would attempt without calculation. The granite's density alone makes its stillness remarkable. It defies gravity through geometry more than weight. The walls fit the chamber with eerie precision, neither tight nor loose, resting as if grown from the room itself. Below its gleam, time has left almost no mark. No soot from torches, no copper stains, no hint of pigment or inscription. Pharaohs loved to carve their names into eternity, yet here no identity claims the work. The absence feels deliberate, a decision rather than neglect. It gives the sense that the box was never meant for funerary display, where decoration affirmed divinity. Some whisper it was never a coffin at all, but a device in a system long forgotten. The walls surrounding it rise in stacked tiers, each layer distributing weight through chambers that older engineers simply called relieving spaces. Look closely and they resemble regulators, as though the builders sought not just stability but resonance. When you stand close, the echo of your own breath seems to multiply. Drop a coin and the sound folds out as multiple waves. Not a single clang but a soft series of bounding pulses. That vibration is what intrigued Christopher Dunn, an engineer trained in precision machining. Studying laser measurements of the surfaces, he proposed that the box and the chamber around it may have interacted as components, an ancient configuration of energy and sound. Granite contains quartz, and quartz under pressure generates an electric pulse, a phenomenon known as the piezoelectric effect. Dunn speculated that if rhythmic vibrations, perhaps from seismic motion or mechanical devices, entered the chamber, the quartz might have responded, converting vibration to energy or amplifying frequency in ways still measurable today. Critics counter that such ideas stretch physics beyond its likely bounds. They point to Egypt's religious rituals, suggesting that tones would have been part of ceremony rather than technology. Perhaps the granite's smoothness was symbolic purity rather than engineering precision, yet the debate persists because the data invite it. Modern plaster molds show interiors square within microns. Even marble artisans using today's abrasive struggle to replicate that exactness without modern rotary tools. The impression left is that someone knew how to remove stone grain by grain, controlling slope and depth with mechanical patience. Somewhere beneath the debate lives a more human question. Who shaped this surface until it turned into mirror stone? Picture a laborer, bare-chested in flickering lamplight, running a hand along the developing plane. The granite bites back at any slip of the tool. Copper dulls too quickly. Sand grinds unevenly. He pauses, dust clinging to his throat, and tests the edge with his fingernail. Smooth. The moment breaks as supervisors shout over the hum of air in the shaft. That touch, the smallest human gesture, connects across thousands of years to the visitor who does the same now, fingers brushing the same line. Surprised that stone can feel that sharp. The box's dimensions reveal another puzzle. Too large to fit through the narrow corridors leading into the chamber, it must have been placed first before the rest of the pyramid closed around it. Builders didn't insert, they built around. That sequence suggests intention far ahead of decoration, as if the pyramid were a casing designed to house this one component. Some suggest it could have held a symbolic substance, perhaps a sacred fluid or a crystalline relic, something now lost. Others imagine it as part of a harmonic system, the granite vibrating with the chamber's shape to produce frequencies tied to ritual or energy transformation. Such theories remain speculative, but the precision demands tension. Measurements show that sound behaves strangely here. Modern instruments detect resonant peaks near specific musical notes, each tied to the pitches that echo within the grand gallery. When a voice hums, even softly, the air thickens. Certain tones grow louder as if reinforced by invisible walls. It is tempting to see the room as an acoustic chamber, the box as its amplifier. No record proves it, yet the experience is direct. Visitors describe a faint tremor in their chest when standing near its center. The stone seems to respond, though the ears hear only air moving. This interplay between human and architecture might explain why the early explorers thought the pyramid as alive, a quiet presence rather than inert geology. For those who accept the mainstream view, the box is simply a sarcophagus, robbed in antiquity, its occupant lost to looters. Yet if so, the missing lid raises oddities. No residual hinge blocks, no fragments litter the floor. The stone is of a single composition. Most tomb sarcophagi show mixed materials or carvings. Here, nothing of the sort appears. It's as if the lid was never part of the design. Even inside, the corners are crisp, untouched by the abrasives used to hollow ceremonial coffins elsewhere. The perfection of the finish almost negates human involvement. It appears manufactured rather than carved. Supporters of Dunn's line of reasoning note the machining parallels, a level surface typical of industrial tooling rather than hand polish. Weight distribution within the chamber deepens the enigma. The pressure of millions of tons above funnels down through small connective points, separated by 5 great granite beams stacked in alternating directions. The arrangement mirrors modern systems that disperse tension, like safety valves in structures designed to absorb stress. Engineers call this smart load management. In a tomb, such precision seems unnecessary. The builders prepared not merely for eternity but for function, a stability that might have mattered to operation, not just preservation. Even the act of quarrying calls for speculation. The Aswan quarries remain scarred with half-freed obelisks, their lengths cracked mid-cut, evidence of tools failing against the material's will. Moving a finished box of this size would require immense coordination. Rafts across the Nile, sledges dragged over prepared causeways, lubricated perhaps with water or oil. Yet no record details such transport for the king's chamber. The absence of inscription where a feat deserved boasting adds another silence to the story. Perhaps the craftsman answered to no king whose name survived. Some whisper they belong to a different age entirely, one remembered by Khufu's court only as legend. Among engineers, discussions of the box often drift toward the strange idea that the pyramid as a whole behaves like a tuned circuit. The Earth's own low-frequency vibrations feeding through limestone layers, amplified by granite conductors at its core. Quartz within the granite could, under certain pressures, generate measurable currents. If that happened, even weakly, the structure could have produced electromagnetic fields. No evidence of external connections or coils exists, yet the symmetry tempts speculation. Why else design with such repetition of proportion if not for resonance? Perhaps the builders pursued harmony, not power, a kind of architectural meditation between matter and planet. The psychological effect supports that. Stand inside the king's chamber, let quiet settle until heartbeat and echo blend, and you begin to hear faint modulations, a soft rolling hum where none should be. Some describe vertigo, others calm. The line between physics and perception blurs. If the architecture indeed manipulates frequency, the granite box could serve as both receiver and anchor, a transducer in modern language, rather than a coffin. That thought alone gives the monument another face, not a tomb but an experiment anchoring sound to stone. There is also the aesthetic of absence. Every other royal resting place in Egypt exhibits narrative, painted walls, texts guiding the soul. Here, nothing. No gods march across the surfaces. No spells coil between corners. Only geometry speaks. The absence of art may be art itself, the form's purity intended to preserve something untranslatable. Temples often used polished stone to reflect ritual light. Perhaps this one reflects sound instead, a sensory practice erased when religion turned silent. Scholars prefer cautious explanations, noting that unfinished carvings or later damage may have erased markings we no longer see. A blank surface to them represents practical choice. Granite too hard to incise, priorities set elsewhere. But the broader context complicates that. The chamber's architecture suggests deliberation in every stone alignment, north-south orientation, equal spacing, sealed channels aiming upward through the masonry. Nothing about it seems improvisational. If cost dictated simplicity, why not use softer material? Instead, we find perfection without identity, deliberate mystery. One small detail catches the light. Along one interior edge, a groove runs parallel to the rim, precisely linear yet shallow, like the trace of a vanished lid or a mechanical seat. Some say it was carved for a cover now missing. Others argue it housed an insert or conduit, perhaps an element that focused acoustics or stabilized vibration. Whatever its purpose, its precision mirrors that of machine tooling, not ornamental but pragmatic. The groove refuses to explain itself. It lies there, narrow as a blade's width, waiting for the right perspective to reveal function. Supporters of energetic interpretations imagine liquid mercury, crystalline arrays, or some form of resonance chamber once enclosed within. Critics call this fantasy born of modern projection, preferring to credit symbolic representation of the king's rebirth, the box as womb of stone. These two visions rarely meet, except in the shared awe that something so tangible can remain so ambiguous. The box stands as convergence between science and ritual, measurable yet mystical, mechanical yet sacred. Think of how the chamber must have looked at completion. Fresh granite gleaming with the reflection of torchlight, air uncut by centuries of visitors, the pyramid above newly sealed. Workers step back, dusting their palms, silence closing over them like clay setting. One looks once more into the polished hollow and sees his own face inverted on the surface, fleeting when the torch gutters out. It might be that this was the point, to leave something perfect enough to reflect the builder even when time erased his name. The theory that the pyramid functioned as a power generator remains highly disputed. Still, the precision within the king's chamber keeps that question alive. If vibration and geometry were central to its design, the granite box could represent a key component, a resonant node in a vast circuit of stone. For others, it is only coincidence, order emerging from human perseverance and mathematical instinct. Yet either path leads to wonder. The box continues to hum with unanswered logic, its presence less memorial than mechanical, as if waiting for the signal it once knew. And once you accept the possibility that some chambers were built not as tombs but as instruments, your attention drifts inevitably to the sealed spaces beyond, to the shafts still blocked by stones, the corridors mapped by bursts of energy but unreachable by hand. One mystery opens into another, leading upward toward the unopened doors that have waited through dynasties and dust for touch once more. The shaft was never meant for human passage. Barely the width of a man's handspan, it disappears into the southern wall of the Queen's chamber, perfectly square, perfectly angled, vanishing into gloom. In 1993, a small machine made of aluminium rods, rubber treads, and a camera no bigger than a coin began crawling through that narrow throat of stone. Its name was Poitou, an ancient word meaning opener of the ways. The name suited the task, an explorer built not of flesh but of circuitry, charting a passage sealed since the Age of Kings. Its motors hummed softly against the limestone, each rotation sending a faint cloud of dust swirling back toward the chamber below. For more than an hour, the camera showed only the claustrophobic geometry of the shaft. Smooth limestone gave way to small tool marks, veering slightly at precise angles to maintain a 45-degree climb. Then something glimmered ahead, two small copper pins protruding from a pale slab at the tunnel's end. Up you out two drew closer, its light washing over what looked to be a fitted door, not a blockage of rubble but a crafted gate. The copper was green with age, though still intact, like handles waiting for hands that never came. The slab behind them was limestone cut to match the shaft so exactly that no dust line marked its edge. The signal crackled as Gantenbrink, the engineer behind the project, adjusted his controls from the base of the pyramid. The robot halted just short of the obstruction. On the monitor, the reflection of its light curved over the door's face and faded into stillness. For a few moments, no one in the control room spoke. The feed carried only the faint electrical hum. Then a technician whispered the obvious. They had reached the end, or perhaps not the end, but the beginning of another section entombed beyond reach. The copper fittings hinted at intention, something designed to be closed. The realization spread slowly. Every shaft in the Great Pyramid had been mapped on paper for centuries, but none had been followed this far. The copper-pin door was a presence from deep time, its patient symmetry suggesting knowledge, not coincidence. Yet science demands restraint. Gantenbrink recorded coordinates, measured angles, and confirmed the find. Upstairs, desert wind hissed through scaffold poles, while cameras from a German television crew rolled tape that would circle the world by nightfall. Within days, the footage appeared on broadcasts across Europe. The idea that a robot had found a sealed door inside the Great Pyramid, something untouched for millennia, caught imaginations everywhere. Ancient enigmas had new breath, and back at Giza the security around the site grew tighter. Permission for further exploration was paused, described as temporary. Temporary became indefinite. Communication between the team and the authorities cooled, then stopped. The Upuit-2 itself remained stored at the base camp, waiting for new orders that never came. Interest flickered, then politics took over. The shaft returned to darkness, the two copper scars closing the light out once more. Years passed while the question lingered. What lay beyond that limestone seal? Some whispered of a hidden chamber, perhaps symbolic, perhaps functional. Others dismissed it as a construction feature, meant only to balance pressure across the pyramid's inner mass. Yet even skeptics admitted surprise at the precision. An empty shaft would have sufficed for balance. The sealed door, with copper pins, spoke of deliberate concealment. By the early 2000s, technology had leapt forward. A new team gained limited authorization to repeat the attempt using a machine called the Pyramid Rover, fitted with a miniature drill, fiber optics, and contact sensors fine enough to detect the vibration of air itself. The world tuned in again, screens flickering under the same tension that had gripped audiences a decade earlier. The tiny drill touched limestone in September 2002. Dust spiraled like pale smoke inside the shaft as the bit chewed forward. Minutes stretched while operators on the surface measured torque to avoid fracturing the ancient stone. When the drill finally broke through, a small hole appeared, just wide enough for light to enter. Through that pinhole, a fiber optic camera snaked into the space. The expectation was clear: a chamber, carvings, an inscription. Instead, the lens revealed a second slab, almost identical to the first, set upright only a few centimeters beyond. No text, no treasure, only another perfect wall. Two barriers in sequence, both carrying the same deliberate silence. In the control van, voices overlapped: questions, recalculations, disbelief. The angle of the drill hole was checked, confirmed. It was not an illusion. Behind one sealed stone stood another, as though the architecture of mystery had been designed to perpetuate itself. Gantenbrink watched this second transmission, not from Giza, but from his own workshop in Germany. The glow from the monitor reflected off scattered schematics and small circuit boards. He analyzed each still frame, freeze-pausing between glimpses of the copper pins. On his wall hung the original design sketches for Upuit 2, each note written in tidy pencil lines. In those days he had believed a door, once found, meant an opening. Now he stared at proof that even discovery had its limits. Every advancement led only to another seal. It became a pattern repeating across the study of the pyramid, knowledge arriving precisely where access ended. Some supporters suggested the configuration could be symbolic, representing barriers to the afterlife. Critics countered that such ideas romanticized technical errors. Perhaps the builders had simply changed design mid-construction, but that explanation often faltered when measured against the precision of the fit. Millimeter accuracy is not the hallmark of improvisation. Whether for metaphysical or practical reasons, those hidden stones seemed meant to resist intrusion across time. The shafts that funneled air or guided stars now functioned as messages in code, geometry that answered questions with echo rather than speech. The public fascination with that sealed door lingered like an afterimage on old film. Journalists wrote and rewrote stories about timelines, lost chambers, and the politics of permission. Even the simplest facts, the length of the shaft, the material of the pins, became battlegrounds for competing interpretations. Yet the door itself did not move. Technology paused at its surface, the same way water rests at a dam's edge. One could measure everything about it: the angle, texture, echo of sound when tapped, but not what lay beyond. In a paradox that felt almost human, the oldest mechanical design on record was now frustrating the newest. Late-night footage from that era still circulates in archives. The little rover bumping forward, the muffled scrape of its treads, the sudden glare of the door filling the frame. No narration, just the steady whir of motors and the sharp cut to black. The broadcast ended without conclusion, leaving viewers staring at their own reflection in dark screens, waiting for more color or sound that never came. It is said that after the mission closed, the corridor was resealed. Whatever tool marks the left were likely covered by dust again. In the heat of the plateau afternoon, sand drifted back over the entrance, flattening footprints within hours. In that sense, the experiment became metaphor as much as event. Human curiosity driving into a passage smaller than its own shoulders could fit, reaching the edge of comprehension, then meeting a wall. The copper pins glimmered briefly under artificial light, and then the pyramid reclaimed its muteness. Some archaeologists took comfort in the closure, arguing that the site's integrity must be preserved until better instruments were ready. Others felt unease, sensing that waiting might become forgetting. Between those positions stretched the long quiet of bureaucracy, where time measures itself not in centuries but in signatures and stamps. Gantenbrink, now older, kept one still image pinned above his desk. The moment the light falls evenly on the limestone, defining the thin seam where the door meets its frame. It wasn't treasure, he once told an interviewer. The true value lay in the riddle of intent. Why seal a tunnel so carefully that only machines millennia later could detect its precision? Why place metal where no living eyes would see it? The pyramid's builders had invested skill not for visibility but for endurance, a design meant for an audience far in the future, or perhaps for none at all. Some whisper that the paired doors form part of a mechanical sequence, like valves regulating energy or sound. Supporters suggest acoustics, pressure, or astronomical timing could have guided their placement. Critics dismiss those ideas as overreach, simple traps of modern imagination. Still, the material facts remain: copper, limestone, symmetry, and deliberate closure. The curiosity this small device awakened did not fade because of what it revealed, but because of what remained sealed. Each time machines approach the unknown with light, they find craftsmanship that prefers darkness. As decades pass, sensing technology continues to evolve. Instead of wheels and treads, the tools of exploration now use invisible waves, muons from cosmic rays, high-frequency radar, quantum imaging that can map cavity spaces through solid stone. While those devices hum quietly in laboratories, the lesson of the Upur-2 lingers. Even the smallest gateway in an ancient monument can redraw the line between what we know and what we are meant to wonder about. And just above that original shaft, hidden from view, a polished limestone door still waits behind another, copper pins folded into shadow, holding secrets that technology has only begun to knock upon. Muon detectors do not look like cameras, yet they draw pictures out of invisible rain. Each particle that falls through the atmosphere sketches a faint trace as it passes through stone, and when enough of these cosmic signatures collect, walls take shape where the eye cannot reach. Inside the Great Pyramid, those traces slowly built an image no archaeologist expected, a length of nothingness exactly where the monument should have been most solid. The discovery arrived quietly in 2017, halfway between routine calibration runs. The Scan Pyramids team had placed detectors deep inside passageways and chambers, logging rays day after day until patterns emerged. On their monitors bloomed the outline of an enormous void, roughly 30 meters long, suspended above the known Grand Gallery like a heartbeat paused in midair. No crack or hollow gap, no floor in the rock, the statistics held to too neat a line. For the scientists who watched, the data looked almost scripted, as if the pyramid itself had written a secret in negative space. At first, the group spoke cautiously. They called it a big void rather than a chamber, aware of how quick the world can be to hear myth behind measurement. Yet the dimensions pressed against disbelief. 30 meters could swallow a train car whole. It could house an aircraft's fuselage. Within days, the images circled the globe, headlines struggling between restraint and awe. A monument mapped by physics had confessed a passage that no human light had touched in for millennia. In a narrow tent pitched against the stones, the team huddled over printouts. Someone adjusted a lamp, its glow falling on rows of numbers that refused to vanish under scrutiny. The air smelled faintly of ionist dust and stale coffee. One researcher traced the outline of the void with a pencil and tapped twice on the edge of the paper, as if testing its weight against sense. Outside, the night wind rubbed against the limestone, cool and dry, whispering through half-open scaffolds. The instruments kept humming. Muon tomography does not lie easily. It uses the rain of charged particles born from space itself. These particles pass through planets, mountains, flesh and steel, but scatter differently depending on what they strike. Where there's more density, fewer reach the receiver. Where the path is hollow, more arrive. When measured over months, the difference becomes a shape. In this case, the shape stretched longer than the Grand Gallery underneath it, sitting exactly along the pyramid's central spine. The odds of random error were microscopic. Yet soon after announcement, the official statements began to frame the void as structural, support beams of ancient ingenuity, nothing of ritual or mystery. But that wording created more questions than it resolved. Structural against what load? The mass above had held for millennia without evidence of bowing, and why the precision of location, centered as a mirror to the gallery below. Supporters of alternative study quietly suggested intent, symmetry, maybe even function. Critics countered, pointing out that internal gaps can form from phased construction or leftover ramps forgotten during final casing. No tool has yet proven either story true. Late night within the museum compound, an engineer leaned over his notebook, scratching cross-sections by weak light. He murmured that even an accidental space would need logical access, otherwise debris would have filled it during building. Clean and entire were words not typical for such voids. He drew a small arrow indicating a possible link toward the upper relieving chambers, then crossed it out again, frustrated by the lack of entry marks. The pencil snapped. He sat back and rubbed the remains of graphite between his fingers, feeling both marvel and futility in the same motion. Years later, in 2023, new detectors placed along the north face revealed another surprise. Beneath the polished casing stones near the original entrance, high above the crowd lines, appeared a slim corridor, about 9 meters long, hidden just behind the facade. Endoscopic cameras slid through a hole drilled no larger than a coin. On screen, the explorer saw pristine limestone walls, smooth and untouched. Even the drill dust was lighter in shade, suggesting air sealed away since construction. It looked less like a random pocket and more like an intentional antechamber, set precisely in line with symmetry, again echoing the passageways beneath it. Outside, cameras recorded hands shielding eyes from glare as technicians squinted at the small monitor. A breath escaped someone's lips, a sound halfway between laughter and disbelief. The footage lingered on walls without carvings or soot, a purity that did not fit expectation, but within hours the feed went silent. Official representatives appeared, describing the finding as a minor cavity, essentially decorative. Reports were withdrawn into administrative review. The opening was carefully resealed with mortar matching the surrounding hue, almost as though nothing had occurred. For those who had watched the feed, the abrupt stop carried its own rhythm, a refrain of many earlier pauses at Giza. Discovery, applause, then restriction. It felt less like coincidence and more like a familiar choreography, one repeated each time new data threatened to reshape the pyramid story. Some whisper that the pyramid guards its chronology through the institutions that claim to study it, that even in modern hands, access remains governed by invisible right rather than reason. Others dismiss that as paranoia born of slow bureaucracy. Whatever the motive, the result is the same: questions waiting longer than answers. Meanwhile, the muon data continued to be processed in quiet academic offices. Each new model adds definition. Each photon decay helps refine the emptiness inside. A few lines in technical reports note additional density discrepancies beyond the confirmed void, but they end politely with the phrase, requires further validation. Translation, nothing to announce. Yet through scientific restraint a deeper resonance hums, the sense that the pyramid may mirror not just cosmic geometry, but also layered intention, every hollow as deliberate as every stone. The big void has never been entered. No mechanical probe slid inside. No camera has mirrored its darkness. Its content? Air? Dust? Perhaps stacked granite or an inner mechanism remains unknown. If air, then a pocket still pure since construction, an ancient breath preserved. If stone, then blocks forming a resonator, perhaps designed to equalize pressure or echo frequency. Supporters of speculative engineering have noted how the volume's placement aligns with predicted nodes within a vibrating structure. Critics counter that coincidences grow plentiful when patterns are sought across a monument dense with angles. Both sides speak softly now, wary of the press cycle that once ignited too fast and burned their nuance away. A physicist from the project once mentioned, off record, that the data itself felt like a pulse, not literal but rhythmic, how particle rates rose and fell with solar activity, adding life to the static stone. He would run his hand across a plot printout, tracing curves as if to calm them. There's poetry in that kind of science. Inside a monument built from tomb lore and stellar alignment, invisible cosmic rain keeps writing the present over the pixel by pixel. For visitors standing outside on bright afternoons, none of this is visible. The pyramid keeps its smooth face of erosion and repaired joints, unbothered by the speculation burrowing beneath its equations. Children shield their eyes to look up. Tour guides repeat the words tourists expect to hear: Khufu, ramp, dynasty, and move on. Yet somewhere 11 million muons per minute are still piercing that limestone, mapping unseen layers hidden above their heads. The detectors, guarded from dust, tick quietly under canvas, their readouts like whispers of light pinned into graphs. At the edges of these measurements lie something more abstract, the silence surrounding confirmed evidence. In most sciences, discovery leads to replication. Here, it leads to sealing. The corridor behind the north face was closed again, mortar blending with history, its brief exposure already fading from official itineraries. The large void remains data on a screen. It exists proven by cosmic particles, yet not acknowledged as part of the accessible monument. That paradox, discovered by physics and suppressed by policy, turns an engineering marvel into a living mystery. Stand near the monument at dusk and it almost hums. Tourists start to thin out. The heat drains from the stones. Somewhere within that geometry of void and wall, space and mass balance perfectly, holding their secret equilibrium. It's tempting to think of the builders, whoever they truly were, leaving such chambers not by accident but by message. A record that future technology would one day uncover without physical entry, as if the monument knew how human caution would evolve. Perhaps they trusted that when we finally learned to see through rock itself, we'd be ready to read what lay inside. The big void is still there, unmoved, untouched, mapped in invisible ink by the sky, and the pattern repeats. Discovery, denial, delay. Each revelation followed by closure. Each corridor is sealed behind explanations rehearsed for comfort. It hints at something more durable than the stone, an unseen architecture of control, one that defines not just what the pyramid conceals, but what mankind is permitted to remember. On certain nights, satellite maps of Earth show faint halos where no modern cities glow. Ancient stone circles glimmer in Turkey's dust. Terraced ruins breathe under the Andean sky, and near the coast of Lebanon, Cyclopean blocks lie half-buried under evening fog. Each site sits worlds apart, yet the shapes trace the same geometry, a rhythm of right angles and constellations measured long before compasses or telescopes. When the night is still enough, you could almost believe the stones are aligned to one another, as though they remember a common song. Along the Anatolian plateau, a researcher steadies her flashlight between the tall pillars of Göbekli Tepe. The sandstone columns, carved with foxes and vultures, rise 12,000 years into the past. They predate pottery, agriculture, writing, yet they already face the sky as if expecting instruction. Frost dusts each edge where chisel strokes once met, and the air holds that faint mineral scent of freshly broken stone even after 12 millennia. She crouches beside one pillar to copy an etching no larger than her hand, two intersecting lines that mirror the same angle used at Giza. The pencil squeaks against her notebook. A jackal calls somewhere in the scrubland. For a moment, every site linked by these alignments feels present in that single breath. Supporters suggest such precision cannot be coincidence. They point from these Anatolian rings to the pyramids, to the platform at Baalbek, to blocks in the Bolivian highlands precisely cut to interlock like puzzle pieces. Each uses methods that by accepted timelines humanity shouldn't yet command. They wonder whether a network of builders once shared knowledge across distances we consider impossible. Critics counter that human hands have drawn circles and measured horizons since the dawn of curiosity itself, that the stars were common teachers and parallel solutions often blossom where the same needs arise. The dispute hums like low current through the entire field of archaeology, oscillating between admiration and disbelief. In the Andes, star charts burn in cold thin air above Lake Titicaca. On Pumapunku's terrace, an old guide walks tourists along the scattered H-shaped blocks, their corners sharp enough to catch sunlight like steel. The guide runs a fingertip across one cut so exact it casts no perceptible shadow. He tells them these stones once fitted with uncanny precision, forming walls that could resist both earthquakes and time, but he keeps his gaze fixed on the horizon, not on their cameras. The sun shifts and the reflection flares briefly, a flash that might as well be a memory of another age. People come and go, each trying to capture it, but the light never settles long enough for certainty. Across the ocean, waves crash against the submerged ledges of Yonaguni, near Japan's southern islands. Divers descend through blue haze toward a staircase that descends again into deeper dark. Each riser appears leveled by deliberate hands, not the chaos of wave and current. Bubbles race toward the surface like glass beads in reversed rain. Up close, the stone reveals sharp corners softened only by centuries of sea life clinging to the edges. To some, these are remains of a sunken city older than any known in Asia. To others, it is a geological trick, a coincidence carved by weakness in rock and the rhythm of the tide. Yet even skeptics admit it feels planned when standing within it. The debate repeats in different accents and climates, on each continent a variation of the same argument. Still, something about the precision lingers. The pillars at Göbekli, the terraces of Pumapunku and the trilithons of Baalbek share both mathematical awareness and mythic reverence for the heavens. Their axes point towards solstices and crosspoints where ancient calendars would have reset. Under starlight, those alignments feel less technical than ceremonial, a language of stone addressed to the cosmos itself. Beneath the Baalbek Plateau, an engineer stares at three monoliths collectively weighing more than 2,000 tons. Each fits so smoothly against its neighbor that barely a line of moss grows between. The stones appear too massive to move even with modern cranes, yet they rest perfectly aligned, as if mightier tools once danced easily across the quarry. Stories in nearby villages call them the work of giants from before the flood, though no scripture details the event. Whether metaphor or remembrance, the phrase persists. It speaks to an era when knowledge survived by myth alone. Supporters propose that the correlation among these sites hints at a forgotten map, a blueprint once spanning oceans, later fractured by catastrophe. They describe a civilization so old it recycled itself into legends of Atlantis, Mu and Zep Tepi, the first time mentioned on faded temple walls. If true, the Egyptians wouldn't be the inventors of monumentality but the heirs of it, inheritors who adapted earlier blueprints into new ritual purpose. Critics dismiss this as human pattern-seeking, pointing out that random features can always be bent to fit geometry when viewed after the fact. Yet even they pause when confronted with numbers that repeat too tightly to be random. The same angular ratios, the same solar markers, emerging from distant cultures unaware of one another's existence. At Göbekli Tepe, under a clear pre-dawn sky, the field researcher lifts her eyes from the carvings to where the last stars fade near the horizon. She notes the alignment, north by northeast, toward the same arc that once guided Nile floods and Andean sowings. Her breath clouds in the cold air as she traces a line from the stone's top over her own outstretched hand, following it up to where Orion would soon rise. It's an ordinary movement, almost automatic, yet at that angle humanity itself feels older. Beneath her boots lies soil layered by thousands of years of backfill, as if someone had deliberately buried the site once it served its purpose, buried memory disguised as terrain. Some whisper that each of these monuments was closed intentionally, that the knowledge coded into them belonged to a previous cycle humanity could not yet comprehend. Floods, tectonic shifts, and the slow reordering of climate erased their context, leaving shapes that outlived the language meant to explain them. To walk among them today is to read fragments of a sentence missing most of its words. Every excavation becomes both discovery and distortion. The meaning flickers, half-uttered, between science and speculation. In that twilight between fact and myth, parallels multiply. Mythologies from Mesoamerica to Mesopotamia speak of teacher beings emerging from the sea or sky, carrying mathematical order before fading into allegory. Whether metaphors for early astronomers or memories of a lost people, these teachers are always described as restoring balance after chaos. The geometry they left behind, circles, triads, ratios, is both cosmic and practical. The pyramids of Egypt follow this pattern precisely, but with a refinement that feels final, like the last verse of a long-repeated song. Critics call it convergence of human reason. Supporters call it evidence of inheritance. Either way, the melody persists. The question then shifts from how to why. Why would cultures separated by oceans choose the same shapes, the same skyborne alignments, as if running parallel experiments in eternity? Practical explanations surface easily. Astronomy, harvest cycles, structural stability. Yet practicality rarely inspires such grandeur. Perhaps the builders sought not utility, but continuity, a way to file memory into the earth itself. The more permanent the medium, the safer the message. When memory needed to outlast flood or fire, it turned to stone. A traveler standing atop the Giza Plateau at sunset might notice this inheritance without even meaning to. The pyramid's shadow stretches westward until it merges with the desert itself. While far across the Mediterranean, the outlines of other forgotten monuments follow the same sunset. The pattern repeats like a heartbeat, too slow to measure in a single lifetime. That rhythm, echoing in stone, links regions and centuries as though memory itself refuses to die quietly. Some researchers carry fragments of that rhythm with them. Measurements, sketches, digital models that overlay Turkey onto Egypt, Bolivia onto Lebanon. The results often defy conventional explanation. The fits are not perfect, but eerily close, like translations between dialects of a dead language. Even skeptics admit the coincidences are persuasive. But persuasion is not proof, and proof is rare in archaeology older than written word. What remains is inference, a silent conversation between mathematics and mythology. At the night's edge, sand cools faster than stone, and those who work there feel it under their palms, the grainy chill of time itself. They catalog, photograph, argue, but the monuments seem indifferent. Each one exists at a scale designed to ignore us. Maybe the builders intended this, placing memories too vast for individual ego to claim, a kind of humility set in limestone, granite, and basalt. The structures invite participation but resist ownership. The possibility of a global lineage tempts imagination toward catastrophe, something powerful enough to erase not the people, but the continuity between them. Ice, fire, tilted oceans. Supporters imagine an earlier epoch where navigation reached around the planet, where sky and ground were studied as one system. When that system collapsed, its survivors scattered, carrying fragments of design whispered across generations. Later cultures rebuilt them piecemeal, thinking they created miracles from scratch, when in fact they were copying old instructions by instinct. The hypothesis is fragile yet haunting. It offers continuity where textbooks deliver abrupt beginnings. Critics call such continuity romantic illusion. They argue that mathematics and monumentality are universal instincts. The stars offer the same compass to anyone patient enough to watch them. Still, the argument hasn't exhausted itself. Every new site uncovered adds another chord to the composition. Another example of design that seems to anticipate the tools of later ages. What the skeptics call convergence, others call memory resurfacing. Either explanation leaves the same chill. Humanity is capable of remembering further back than it knows. At Baalbek, the wind carries dust across the massive platform as dusk deepens. A crane's light flickers onto an ancient face carved into one of the stones. Below, the modern town hums faintly. Engines, radios, small domestic sounds against the looming quiet of the ruins. Among them, a young archaeologist unrolls a set of blueprints comparing the site's geometry to celestial grids. Her fingers leave faint creases where starlight catches the ink. She says little. The data will rest until funding returns, until permits renew, until the debate opens again. The stones wait without opinion. Meanwhile, thinkers far from the field sift through measurements. They overlay planetary data onto pyramid ratios and find correlations uncanny enough to trouble sleep. Some whisper that a system of Earth-wide calibration once existed, temples marking longitude before the word existed. The Great Pyramid in that case would be no tomb at all but a reference point, a cornerstone in a vanished network. Others dismiss the scale entirely, noting the danger of seeing maps where none exist. Yet the fascination endures, not because the pattern is proven, but because it refuses to dissolve when examined. It endures across every site, each culture, each new denial. The geometry repeats, whispering of a memory older than history and broader than any empire to come. The same angles cut into basalt at Pumapunku reappear in the limestone of Syria, in the sandstone of Turkey, in the granite of Egypt. Whether this is coincidence or echo, no one can say for certain. What's clear is that the impulse to shape stone against the sky, to measure eternity by the movement of stars, belongs to something elemental in us, perhaps innate, perhaps inherited. So the story drifts back toward Giza, no longer an isolated marvel, but part of an unfinished sentence stretching across the globe. If the pyramids are not the first words but the last of something greater, then what vanished library do they preserve? And why were its volumes written in stone rather than clay or flesh? Whether prehistoric or dynastic, someone, maybe many someones, wanted these forms to survive when every other record failed. The sand shifts again, settling briefly over the shapes. The message remains unread but very much alive. The story narrows to a quiet office where light from the desert filters through high, dust-streaked windows. Beneath the hum of an aging air conditioner, papers lie unsigned and phone lines go still. This isn't where discoveries are made. It's where they wait. At Giza, the most immovable stones are no longer granite or limestone but layers of policy and permission. Each drill, each sensor, each inch of ground scanning depends on signatures more carefully guarded than Pharaoh's seals. Those seeking to peer beneath the plateau now draft more memos than maps, their tools boxed while the sand remembers no one's impatience. The modern gatekeeper wears not a crown but an official stamp, and progress arrives only when bureaucracy decides the hour is safe. Investigations often halt the instant they begin to cross into uncharted ground. After ground-penetrating radar sweeps in 2008 suggested a maze of chambers beneath Giza, authority spokesman stated, "There is nothing there." The line sounded final, almost ceremonial, though photographs had already circulated of cut shafts and geometric voids. Shortly after, authorization for deeper survey work dissolved and access was withdrawn. Reports vanished into institutional archives. In that quiet cessation, no denial of data, only denial of attention. An older pattern showed itself again. A find too new to explain simply ceased to exist in the official story. The plateau, one might say, shelters both its secrets and its silence under the same sand. Decades earlier, a different discovery reached the same invisible threshold. Rudolf Gantenbrink's small robot, Up You Out 2, had journeyed through a narrow southern shaft of the Great Pyramid, its lenses recording stone untouched for 4,000 years. When the path ended at a small limestone door fitted with copper pins, curiosity exploded worldwide. Yet by the following week his project was cancelled, his credentials withdrawn. The reason cited was simple: he had exceeded his mandate. The phrasing was bureaucratic, not emotional, but its meaning was clear. Curiosity had crossed into trespass. The find remained, but access to it became another sealed space. He left Egypt, his data intact yet unfinished. His story folded neatly into the archive of discoveries that stopped just short of revelation. Inside official circles, explanations sound more measured. Regulations protect sites from damage, commercialization, or nationalist rivalry. Egypt's monuments belong to humanity, yes, but they also anchor national identity, tourism, and stability. To disturb that balance even unintentionally risks political cost. The same walls that secure relics from looters now guard narratives from upheaval. Some in the field whisper that the desire to manage heritage has grown into a policy of containment, preserving not simply the stones, but the interpretation tethered to them. Others counter that secrecy preserves dignity, that endless speculation from outsiders threatens to strip sacred ground of its meaning. Between those postures, data languishes in sealed folders while public curiosity fills the void. A small story echoes the frustration beneath those policies. A graduate archaeologist in her 20s waits in a modest apartment near Cairo University. Her instruments, compact LiDAR scanners, notebooks sheathed in sandproof plastic, sit on the floor, packed for a dig that may never begin. She checks her email hourly for the single permit number that grants entry to a site west of the pyramid. Days become weeks. By the time the message arrives denying her request, the dry season is ending. Excavation will resume next year perhaps. She presses her palm to the metal case of her equipment before sliding it back under the bed. The future of investigation feels less like exploration and more like suspension, a waiting game in fluorescent rooms. The repetition of this pattern is hard to ignore. Mariette's inventory, steel which suggested the Sphinx predated Khufu, was declared irrelevant. Gantenbrink's tunnel door was sidelined. Surveys mapping underground voids beneath Giza were refuted within hours. Each episode ends with the same refrain: closure following discovery, quiet replacing curiosity. The rhythm itself forms a structure as deliberate as the pyramid's geometry yet invisible, an architecture of restriction rather than stone. In this framework, knowledge doesn't vanish by accident. It is catalogued, approved, and buried under classification codes instead of sand. The stillness feels almost protective, as if officialdom fears that too much daylight might fracture the myth of orderly progress from quarry to pharaonic glory. Supporters of the restrictive approach claim that uncontrolled exploration risks damage, or worse, misinterpretation that fuels pseudo-archaeology. Critics answer that silence breeds exactly those distortions, that secrecy draws imagination the way an empty tomb draws dust. Without accessible data, the field becomes a chessboard where speculation fills the gaps official reports will not address. Somewhere between both lies the truth. Evidence exists, but ownership of its meaning remains contested. In that struggle, the humble trowel becomes symbolic, a tool once wielded against time now dulled by administration. The tension extends beyond academic dispute. The plateau remains one of the most politically delicate archaeological zones on Earth. International funding, national sovereignty, and public image intertwine like threads through linen. Each announcement must align with heritage, tourism, and state prestige. Discoveries framed in mythologic terms attract attention that officials deem both valuable and dangerous. A new corridor or chamber implies a new story, and stories once released cannot be recalled. Better, perhaps, to keep them within the labyrinth until context can be managed. This cautious choreography has persisted through changes of government, echoing the same guarding instinct. Part protection, part possession. Behind all this stands a question difficult to trace in paperwork. Whom does history belong to? Archaeologists, politicians, citizens, or the quiet stones themselves? The system seems to suggest that history is a limited resource, distributable only by those licensed to interpret it. Yet the paradox deepens. Authority preserves authenticity even as it silences expansion. The pyramid, unresponsive to debate, continues to hint at multiple timelines. Its geometry doesn't yield permits, its resonance unmoved by policy. Still, no tool may touch its inner vaults until consensus says so. Some whisper that the control of access masks not fear of physical harm but fear of conceptual collapse. To confirm chambers older than recorded Egyptian history would demand a rewrite of the civilization's lineage. That possibility could redistribute not only academic credit but cultural identity, the heart of national symbolism founded upon the pharaohs. Others dismiss such speculation as romantic paranoia, arguing that most anomalies resolve into simpler engineering or geological explanations once investigated fully. Yet that logic loops upon itself. If investigation halts before it begins, resolution never arrives. The unknown remains officially non-existent. The office where these choices play out seldom matches the grandeur of the mystery. Fluorescent lights flicker above worn desks. Air smells faintly of ink and old paper. Files marked confidential pending review rest beside souvenir figurines of Tutankhamun. A radio plays distant pop songs over static while a single official signs a form that decides the fate of years of preparation. Outside, the pyramids press their timeless silhouette against the sky, massive and mute. Inside, human frailty, the wish for control, the fear of error decides which truths proceed and which are paused indefinitely. Across continents, this struggle repeats under different names. At Machu Picchu, drone access is limited to protect fragile terraces. At Göbekli Tepe, only select trenches remain visible, while the rest waits for future generations. Each site balances preservation with revelation, but at Giza the scale amplifies everything: the scrutiny, the mistrust, the temptation to manage mystery itself. The result is a world-class paradox, an open-air wonder that remains largely closed beneath its surface. We can visit, photograph, and marvel, yet we cannot truly inquire without keys kept behind closed doors. For the ordinary visitor standing in sunlight between the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid, none of this administrative shadow shows. Tour guides tell smooth stories refined through decades of repetition, approved by curriculum and brochure. Only those who chase the paperwork feel the weight of the invisible structure that overrides excavation grids and timelines. The archaeologist with her unused scanner feels it. So did Gantenbrink as correspondence ceased. So did every researcher asked to revise findings for contextual alignment. The pattern gathers over generations, quiet yet cumulative. If the monuments once symbolized unity between Earth and cosmos, their modern twin is this deep tangle of paperwork binding curiosity to caution. The architecture of concealment isn't carved from limestone anymore. It breathes in offices and conferences, in non-disclosure clauses and postponed permits. And beneath it the plateau holds still, layered not only with sand but with unanswered intent. What it guards may be older than empire or city, perhaps older than the story of kings itself. From these bureaucratic corridors another kind of mystery begins, one that speaks not of secret chambers or alien tools, but of the human impulse to curate our own origins. Out of denial and delay rises an unspoken question, quiet yet immense. If every doorway in the record is locked, what memory waits behind it, and who among us will be allowed to see? At this hour the pyramid settles into shadow. The stone cools, the edges blur, and the sound of the desert fades until even the breath of wind seems careful not to intrude. Somewhere beneath that weight, chambers lock around their own quiet mathematics. Supporters suggest the builders meant for more than ceremony, that the structure itself was a kind of message, one not made for a single lifetime, but for everyone that might follow. The ancient Egyptians called their tombs houses of eternity, yet the Great Pyramid holds nothing of Khufu but rumors. Maybe that absence is the truer inscription. Its geometry, aligned to the stars and scaled to planetary measure, could be an archive of what to remember when language fails. Even the granite box, empty and resonant, behaves less like a coffin and more like a tuning device, translating the planet's pulse into stone. If so, the monument keeps not the dead, but the rhythm of a world before flood and fire. Some whisper that after each collapse, when maps are redrawn and histories erased, civilization begins again beside these markers, decoding fragments of a former wisdom. Others counter that such meaning is projection, human need shaping symmetry into story. Yet the pattern endures. Wherever time erodes memory, stone remains, waiting for eyes able to read it. If these monuments are archives, they ask what else we've forgotten. Who first decided that numbers and stars could outlast flesh? Who thought to write permanence into architecture itself? The dunes creep a little more each year, swallowing and revealing by turn, as if testing our attention. And one day, perhaps when the air is still and the constellations shift just so, the oldest of those messages will surface again, quiet as breath, and the world will remember it was never truly alone. Thank you so much for watching. See y'all in the next one video. If you like my channel, like and subscribe.